So, hi, I'm Jessica Harrop. I am the head of production and development at a company called Sandbox Films. And we are a small documentary studio, for those of you who haven't heard of us. We were launched in January of 2020, and we currently have about 25 feature-length documentaries some out in the world, some in development, and some in production. We're based in New York, and we're a team of around 6 people. And sort of our mission is to tell artist-driven, boundary-breaking stories about the process of doing science. So we work on feature-length nonfiction films about the scientific process. We're mission-driven, artist-first, nonprofit, and genre redefining. So what we're trying to do is we're trying to tell stories that come to us by artists who have sort of new ideas on how to sort of break the mold and how science stories are being told. Because our funding comes from a large family foundation, the Simons Foundation in New York, we are a nonprofit company. So any money we might make from our films actually gets reinvested into other projects. So, what were our sort of founding goals? What are we trying to do at Sandbox? I'm just giving you a little bit of background because I think it's important. We really want to produce cinematic, science-focused films that break through to large mainstream audiences. I think so many science documentaries and so much science television now is really aimed at people who seek science content, people who want to watch a science program, not necessarily people who just want to be entertained. So we're really trying to break through to mainstream audiences with our films. We're trying to foster more diversity in science documentary, both in front of and behind the camera. So we're really trying to work with diverse voices in the science space, scientists who come from different universities, different backgrounds, and also artists who have different points of view. And finally, we want to really support emerging science storytellers. So maybe filmmakers who have never done a science film before. And not just work with people who are sort of, again, calling themselves like science enthusiasts, but really sort of trying to break through to mainstream audiences. So I'm going to talk a little bit about what this means. How do we break through? How do we make these films? And when you're pitching your ideas, I'm just sort of some of the things to think about when you're thinking about how you might tell a science story in a new way. Because as we all know, communicating science can be really hard. And here are some reasons why. Scientists are trained to speak different languages. Each branch of science, you have your phrases like hematopoietic stem cells. The general public has no idea what those are. So you have to sort of translate this language. That's a blood producing cell, or every single one of you has a different way of talking about your work that even other scientists don't necessarily understand. So it's a huge communication challenge. And when you're pitching your work and you're thinking about, how to talk to people who aren't in your field, really thinking about that translation issue, it's very challenging. Scientists, also aren't trained to be film subjects. You're trained to be scientists. So, how do you sort of bridge that gap and communicate to people who don't necessarily know your background and where you're coming from? And then finally, so many stories end with this like big, beautiful Hollywood ending. It's tied up in a bow. There's the big breakthrough discovery, or something really, really exciting happens or is resolved. And in science, it's such an iterative process. You're asking a question, you get an answer that makes you ask another question, and it kind of goes on cyclically for a really long time. And so you don't always have your film ending. You set out to make a film and you actually don't know how it's going to end. And that's very hard when trying to get somebody to finance your film if you don't really know what the ending is going to be, and it's not necessarily going to be a big breakthrough. So how do you sort of communicate that to people? And so all of these communication challenges, I think, have led to what I like to refer to as science programming, with a capital S. This idea that like science has to be communicated in a very specific way. And I'll say my background is actually working in science programming. I worked in science television as a producer for over a decade, so I'm very used to this world. But it is the world that Sandbox Films is trying to sort of break us out of. So science programming, you see these tropes, these things that we've come to sort of recognize as being like science communication. And these are things like having a voice of God narrator. You have somebody who's really teaching you the science, telling you what it is that the scientists have found out. It's very didactic. It's very much information driven instead of curiosity driven. And it's often sort of either goofy guy or a very serious sort of all-knowing voice, and it doesn't really give you that much opportunity to think for yourself because it's so sort of didactic. Another thing we see all the time in science communication are these computer-generated sort of science graphics. They tend to be these sort of primary colors. They all sort of look similar. Here we have, DNA in the brain and outer space. These are the things that we think of as like science. But again, this isn't necessarily what science has to look like. And, the general public seeing these, if there's somebody who's not necessarily seeking out science, they might sort of be turned off by these images. If they think of themselves as not, a science enthusiast. And we always see scientists, wearing lab coats and looking at microscopes. I mean, this is not what scientists look like, but this is what, television has sort of decided the scientist looks like. And, I think it really makes scientists almost into this category of other, this sort of other population of people that knows things and that behaves differently than we do. And it's not necessarily helpful in communicating science to sort of put scientists in these uniforms, because really scientists, look like, normal people. Everybody has their own style and their own sense of self. So, we're really trying to sort of break away from this sort of trope. And finally, and sort of most importantly, science becomes a subject and not a story. So science becomes, an hour on ocean acidification or an hour on what is a black hole. And you're getting a lot of information and you're getting a lot of, this is science, but you're not really getting a story. You're not really connecting to the scientists. You're not really connecting to the work. You're not really like being asked to do critical thinking when you're watching an hour on black holes, for example. So, this is really the landscape that Sandbox Films was born out of. And we were looking at all of these sort of tropes and thinking, how can we break away from, this traditional way of telling science stories? And for us, really, it started with the idea of curiosity. We want our films to empower people to think critically for themselves. So with that, I really want to play our Sandbox Films sizzle reel, just to give you a sense of what our films look like.
What a remarkable time to be alive. To actually be on that cusp of not knowing and then discovering.
Our mission is to build a realistic computer model of the human brain.
When people say, "Aren't you playing God?" my real reaction is, nobody is playing in this field.
We have seen and taken a picture of a black hole. Here it is.
Science is a journey. It should take you somewhere where you've not been before.
If you want to sell this program, Turn the camera around.
Can you hear a fucking word I'm saying? Great.
The film crew is gone.
When I draw this firearm, it will activate all the cameras.
Often you don't realize that you're in the middle of a revolution until after the revolution has occurred.
How does life emerge from dead molecules?
What do humans really need to be happy, healthy, and sane?
Biological activity of the brain produces conscious experience.
Wouldn't you think about donating your kidney?
What do we value about human society?
What's the minimum I can measure about the brain to reconstruct it?
Why do you think you're interesting?
Astronauts the same?
How do we make sense of an event?
Are we alone?
Well, that's a really interesting question.
Sometimes a great question is better than ever finding an answer to it.
So our tagline at Sandbox Films is a culture of questioning. We want all of our films to ask more questions than give answers. And we really want people to come away from our films, with all these different ideas, and, they want to Google and they want to learn more. And so for us, this was a way of differentiating our work from sort of the traditional didactic science presentations. And we also really want to tell stories. We don't want to just make films about subject matter. We want people to really engage in entertaining stories. So, for example, instead of making a film that's just about the science of black holes, we put out a film called The Edge of All We Know. It's currently on Netflix if you'd like to check it out. This is actually the backstory of the photograph taken of a black hole. And it's really a story about, teamwork and international collaboration. And, it goes through the sort of challenges that these scientists faced. And, really ends with this photograph and everyone coming together. And it's like a beautiful human story as opposed to just teaching you what a black hole, what we know about black holes right now, and teaching you the science. And in those stories, not subjects, we really want them to be human, and we want them to be emotional. And we want people to come away feeling something, laughing, crying, connecting. And so, we have our film that we're probably most well known for. We were the company behind the film Fire of Love. And this film came out last year. It was lauded by the press as a love story, a great date night movie. No one really talked about it as a science film. It was much more of a cinematic experience. And this was a film about two volcanologists, Maurice and Katja Kraft, who were lovers and who traveled the world photographing volcanoes and studying them. And they were actually they passed away in a volcanic eruption in 1991, leaving behind all of this beautiful footage. So, our film is really their love story told through their footage. And it's a great example of, a human emotional love story, but, also a film that teaches you a lot about volcanoes and really makes people curious to learn more about the science of volcanoes and our connection to the natural world. And another example of one of these human emotional stories that I'm going to talk a little bit more about today as we get more into sort of how to pitch your own ideas is our film Fathom. And this is a film about two women who are trying to communicate with whales. They're two scientists. And it's not just a film about scientific research and what we know about whales. It's a film about these women who are going into the field for months at a time, leaving their lives behind, leaving their friends and family. It's about the psychological toll of field research. It's about what it is to be an early career female scientist and sort of, what what sort of comes with that. And it's just a beautiful sort of portrayal of the process of science and action. And, when this film was pitched to me, I was so moved by this one scene that was one of the first scenes that was shown to me of the footage, because it is these two scientists talking to each other about what it's like to be in the field together. And it really felt so human and so emotional. It was something that I'd never really seen before in a science film. And it really spoke to me, and it made me want to make work on this project with the scientists and the filmmakers. So I want to show you that clip so that you can get a sense of what I mean when I say it's scientists that are really being emotional, and not just sort of teaching us the science.
I know I'm going to come home a different person, and I don't know if that person's going to fit the role that I had before. Like, I went to Antarctica for a month and came home to a dog and a partner that I didn't fit into anymore. And I had to leave them. And I'm terrified that's going to happen again. You know?
Yeah.
I'm terrified I'm not going to fit into that role that I had when I left.
You have to leave it, but not just leave it physically, but also leave it mentally.
You've come into the field for 7 seasons. Have you found a way to come home?
No. Instead, I do the opposite, and I take the things that are precious to me about home, like you, and bring them here. Which seems to make more sense. Because this is a much safer place to be a human.
I'll just point out that the scientists in our films don't wear lab coats, unless obviously they're in a lab and they need to. They get to wear whatever they would wear normally because they are not other. They are human, and they are present, as I'm sure you all are aware, being scientists. And we also think a lot about, who gets to be a scientist in our films. So often you see scientists that come from the same, handful of top universities. A scientist gets, interviewed about CRISPR once, and then everybody wants to interview that same scientist for their films that deal with CRISPR. And really, there are so many different perspectives and so many ways of thinking. And so for us, it's really about scientific thinking, scientific method. Are there voices from indigenous populations who might think about things totally differently than scientists that come from sort of, classic Western education. So, we also like to think about that in our films as well. And then, we talked a little bit about science not having a sort of satisfying Hollywood ending all the time, because, you don't always have your buttoned up result at the end of your science. Science is such an ongoing process. And so for us, it's not about the scientific result. It's about the human journey. And so when you're telling a story, you don't necessarily need an aha discovery moment, as long as the humans that we're following, that we're emotionally connected to, have their story arc, and maybe they discover something about themselves, and that's the discovery that we're excited about, and not necessarily always the scientific result. And so back to our film Fathom, these 2 women who are studying whales, we were filming them over 1 field season. That's not long enough to have some sort of, conclusive, we now know how to talk to whales. And we knew when we set out to make this film that we were not going to be able to watch, people speaking to whales by the end. That was just obvious. So, how do we tell this story in a way that is satisfying to the viewer, if you're not going to have that result at the end. And so for us, it was, how do we really make the viewer feel connected to the women, feel engaged in the science that they're doing, and going on an emotional journey with them, as opposed to only learning about the science that they're doing and then feeling unsatisfied when it's not wrapped up in a bow. We also really like to experiment with form. So I talked before about sort of the voice of God and the big, computer generated graphics. How can we really tell science stories that are more experimental, are just different in the way that they're shot, in the way that they're told. And so for us, we had a film called All Light Everywhere that premiered at Sundance a couple of years ago. And, this is a kaleidoscopic essay film that has multiple different storylines that come together. And it's not, linear in a traditional way. And it won an experimentation award at Sundance for being so creative. And so for us, we're always looking for, ways in which people really have unique and creative ideas for how they want to tell science stories. And that doesn't always have to be, a classic, narrative arc, beginning, middle, end, but, maybe it's just an exploration of an idea told through different kinds of footage from different places that all comes together in an interesting and creative way. Here, I just want to talk a little bit about, as you're thinking about your own stories and your own work, here are some different tools that you can use to sort of break out of these tropes and this template. And I'm going to talk a little bit about sort of narration, graphics, humor, and music to sort of help you as you're thinking about the stories that you want to tell and how you're pitching them. The first being narration. We talked about a voice of God narrator as being this thing that we see all the time in science filmmaking. And, so often you need a narrator because you have this translation issue. You speak your own scientific language and you need somebody to help you translate it. Or it's just a story that requires another voice. You need a narrator as another sort of creative tool in your toolbook to be able to tell the story that you want to tell. So how can you think about that narrator in a way that's more exciting and more unique and not just sort of falling into the sort of more traditional template? So for example, back to our film Fire of Love about Maurice and Katja Kraft, we used a narrator in this film, but she became a character in the film. So we wrote this narration in a very specific way. We had a whole backstory for who the narrator was. She was this young woman who had just gotten through a divorce. We knew exactly what her relationship with the subject matter was. We had all this information about her likes and her dislikes. Obviously, none of this made it into the movie, but when we were writing the narration, it's just so specific. The director Sarah Dosa and her writing team, everything they wrote was so specific to this character that they created. And Miranda July, who is a sort of quirky American actress, writer, she was the voice of the narrator, and she did a really great job, making that narration vulnerable, and her voice cracks, and you really get the sense that she is a character in the film. And so it's not this voice of God telling you information, but it becomes more of a character. And another sort of example of non-traditional narration is our film about CRISPR, which is called Human Nature. And this film, it really allowed the scientists that we interviewed to be their own narrators. So there is not a narrator in the film, even though there is so much science and so much exploration of the discovery of CRISPR. The director, Adam Bolt, really felt strongly that he wanted the scientists to explain their own work. And that was a lot of work for him to do because it's such a complicated subject matter, but it definitely can be done if you're passionate about it. So it's just another, if you're interested in sort of seeing an example of a scientific film that has a lot of science in it, that doesn't have a narrator, I would recommend that you check out Human Nature, which is currently on Netflix. And I'll say that Fire of Love is actually on Disney Plus and Hulu if you'd like to check that one out. We also think a lot about graphics. How can we make our graphics not all look the same and not all look like science with a capital S graphics? So for example, this is from our film, The Edge of All We Know, our black hole film. And we actually did this analog experiment where we created a whirlpool, and this was sort of helping us visualize what a black hole might look like. And it's very beautiful, it's very cinematic, and it's very different. It's not sort of your traditional way of showing a computer-generated black hole. And we also, for this film, worked with an architect to create these architectural drawings to be used in that same film. And so this one shows you sort of the scale of the vastness of the universe through this architectural sort of like architect drawings. And it's really beautiful. It's this beautiful sequence in the film with soaring music, and you're sort of mesmerized by the vastness of the universe when watching this. And it's different than what you normally see in science films. So yeah, here's our little solar system getting smaller. And it's quite beautiful, I think, too. And then finally, for our film Fire of Love, we used this stop motion paper cutout animations. And these were really part of the collage sort of archival feel of the film. And so we wanted the animations to fit in with the rest of the project. And they were made actually from scientific drawings that the two main subjects of the film, Maurice and Katya, actually collected themselves. And so it felt very sort of connected to the look and feel of the film, which is I think so important when thinking about how you want to tell your story. And finally, we really love sort of injecting humor in science. You don't see it very often. We take ourselves so seriously. And I think scientists are taught, you're taught to take yourself seriously because you want people to, listen to you and believe you. But having a sense of humor can be such a engaging thing. Audiences can, let their guard down and relax and have fun and sort of learn something in that process. So many of our films have humor in them. And I can play a couple clips just to sort of show you what I mean by that. The first is actually from our film Fireball, which we made with Werner Herzog and Clive Oppenheimer. And Werner always does such a good job of sort of poking fun at sort of nerdy, quirky scientists. We all identify as nerds, and we all identify as people that love science. And so he just has a good time always sort of poking fun at that. And so I'll show a clip from that now.
Now, I should warn you.
The warning was justified. Yes, indeed, it gets so complicated now that we are not going to torture you with details. Just a sample.
13. So instead of just one icosahedron, we have an icosahedron of icosahedra. And we said, maybe that's a way of building something ever outwards that maintains this structure. But we ran into trouble.
But this model here solved the problem.
And here is a clip from Fire of Love. It's just a cute moment showing some humor. And then finally, we really love to think about music choices in our films, and can we work with interesting artists and composers to really elevate what the music feels like. And we've had a lot of really interesting responses. Here are some reviews that came out of our films All Light Everywhere and Fire of Love. And it's very interesting for a science documentary to have so many reviews that talk about the music and how interesting and fun the music is. So, Dan Deacon did the score to All Light Everywhere. We had Nico Godin, who's part of the band Air, do the score for Fire of Love. And both of these scores are just really fun and elevate the films in ways that are unexpected. So really thinking about music, I think, is also quite important. So, that's sort of in a nutshell how we think about sort of reinventing the science genre a little bit and telling science stories that are emotional and human and that sort of break away from the template that we're used to using to tell science stories. And so now I want to talk a little bit about, when you're pitching your own work, how to sort of communicate what you're trying to do to a potential funder or distributor or partner. So, I'm just going to go through sort of a standard pitch template. The things that you should prepare and the things that you should think about. And then later I'll talk a little bit about just some tips and tricks and just things to be aware of. So I'm going to talk a little bit about Fathom and sort of talk through sort of how that pitch came through, just because it is such a story about the process of doing science and really is the story of these two scientists. And, I'm going to go through these different elements of your pitch that you should really think about a lot before pitching your stories anywhere. And those are your logline, your summary, your visual style and your comps, your audience, your team, and your budget and schedule. Starting with the logline. So a logline is basically 1, 2, 3 sentences that is the essence of the film that you want to make. This is almost the most important thing because I can usually tell if a team has a good logline, they know what they want to do. If a logline is like 5 paragraphs long, it usually means that they're still sort of figuring it out and they don't actually know what they want to make. And so the shorter it is, the more specific it is, the better. So it's almost the hardest thing. You almost want to do it at the end, but you really want to sort of focus on the essence of your film. So for Fathom, the logline was, Fathom follows the lives of 2 whale researchers as they conduct groundbreaking and isolating fieldwork in Alaska and the South Pacific. This feature-length documentary is a deeply intimate portrait of science in action, exploring whale communication and culture, as well as the personal toll that research can take. So this is really the essence of the film, in a couple lines. And so this is the first thing that people will often read. It's really, really important. And the more specific, the better. Even the part that says feature-length documentary, very good to be specific about what it is that you're making. Is it a short? Is it a feature? Is it a documentary? Is it fiction? Is it a series? If it is a series, how many episodes? How many parts? How long? Just being very, very specific in your logline is very important. Then you'll have your story summary. This is a longer, I took part of the story summary for Fathom. It was longer than this, but it gives you just a sense of, this is the background. This is why you're making the film. This is what people will see as they watch the film. This is from the very first pitch. So a lot has changed since this was written. Even one of the 2 scientists is different. So, what you're writing down does not have to be what the film will actually be that you want to make, because we all know that once you start making a nonfiction film, things change and you might find a different story as you're filming and you'll want to pivot, or you'll find a really great, potential subject that you'll want to film and you'll sort of pivot. But the more sort of specific and the more you can let who you're pitching to know that you've thought through what the potential story could be, the better. So, in this example, the director of the film, Drew Xanthopoulos, he was pitching it and he says that, it's a feature documentary. It will follow several of the world's, whale researchers to explore their work. We'll seek to answer these questions. We'll also explore what's known about the science and history of whale sentience, where it's headed, and what it means for how our scientists see themselves. The story arc will build from whale cognitive evolution to communication. So he goes on and sort of just talks about what you'll be seeing, what's going to be, personal stories of the researchers will be woven throughout, all of those things, like what are we going to actually see over the course of the feature-length film. And again, this is not, you're not, bound to what you write here, but the more sort of specific you can be, the better. The next thing is really, what I was talking about earlier. What is this film going to look like? What's going to make it unique and visually different and visually interesting? And what are some films, that are out there already that you can point to that might be similar to the film that you want to make? I always ask, what other documentaries, what fiction films inspire you when you're working on your project? And so for Fathom, it was Interstellar and Arrival. Drew was really looking at science fiction. How do we communicate with a non-human entity? These questions that are deeply rooted in science fiction. And how is he going to sort of create a visual landscape? And so, for him, he talks about traditional verite images with lyrical cinematic grammar, and he sort of talks about the ocean becoming a character and filming the waves and all these kinds of things. And he's really sort of painting a visual picture. He also talked in his pitch about how he's going to use sound design, and there's going to be whale sounds, intermixed with the music, and we're going to be, it's going to be this intimate verite. So it's really, you really want to not just give a sense of your story, but also a sense of visually how you're going to be conveying your story in a way that's beautiful and intriguing and not necessarily expected. And so, as part of that, if you have it, you might not, here are some images from the original deck that Drew shared with us. This was from a test shoot that he did. And you just get a sense immediately of his color palette and of his sort of visual style. These are very sort of beautiful, moody, science fiction-like photographs. And so immediately, and, he also shared a visual sample with us, which you may or may not have if you're sort of just starting out, and it's okay if you don't. But, I showed his visual sample earlier. All of this really gives you a sense of what the film will feel like visually, and also sort of what story it will be telling. And then finally, these things, what is your audience? Who is this film for? And the more specific you can be about that, the better. Is this for, families? Is it kid friendly? Is it more sort of like of a thriller for adults? Is it, international? Is it for, a specific, is it going to really resonate with a specific kind of person? For Fathom, we talked a lot about how we really wanted this film to get in front of young women who are studying science, maybe high school students, to show them that there is a, there are scientists out there that look like them and that have, fears and desires that are similar to their own. And so for us, for Fathom, the audience, being young women who were interested in potentially being scientists was really, really important. And something that spoke to us, as funders and as a production company looking, for projects, we really loved that Fathom might appeal to this demographic. But, your film could have any audience, just, knowing your audience is really important. Also your team, who have you assembled to work on this project? Maybe it's just you. Or maybe you have a director and a producer, or you have a composer attached, or you have a director of photography that you want to work with. I think whoever you've assembled on your team, include in your pitch, and and why is this team the best team to be telling the story? What work have you done that might be of interest that you want to share, in a bio, as part of your pitch? I think more and more we talk about, is this a story that's your story to tell? How connected to it are you, and why do you want to tell it? And sort of what have you done in the past that you can point to that might help whoever you're pitching to understand, what you'll bring to it. Especially if you're working with, a director, what has that director directed before, and what is their sort of vision? So, the team is always really important. And when I'm looking at pitches, I always want to dig in and really think about, who will I be working with if I come onto this project. And finally, how much is it going to cost, and how long is it going to take? We have some science films that we've worked on that have taken 10 years to make. And that's because they were based on a 10-year timeline science experiment. And that was known from the very beginning that it was going to take 10 years. Others, teams will say, once we have all the funding, we can have this film done in 8 months. Here is our schedule. We're filming in June and July, and then we're editing for a couple months, and this is it. And we have it all planned out. And that's also really good to know. So if you have sort of like a timeline of how long you think it will take and how much you think it will cost, and that's always really, really important. You don't necessarily have to always give the budget and the schedule as part of your pitch presentation. You can keep those things to yourself and sort of talk about them, when you're engaging with people. Either way works. Sometimes I think, it's nice to sort of get someone really excited about your vision and your creative, and then tell them how much it's going to cost once they're sort of hooked. But, either way, it's just really important to know what you're asking for and what your needs are when you're pitching something. And so, if you pitch someone something and they get really excited about it, and then they say, well, what do you need and how much does it cost? And you don't have an answer, then it's not helping you get what you want to move forward. So that's basically those are basically the things that you need to prepare and sort of how to think about them. And I'll just end on a couple sort of pitching tips, just things to think about as you're pitching, and just be aware of. And here they are. I'm just going to sort of throw them all out at you. I think, like I said in the log line, the more specific about what you're making, the better. So if you come into a pitch and you say, we're making a 6-part series on the brain, and then the person you're pitching to says, I really only work on feature documentaries. I don't work on series. If you immediately say, well, it can be a feature documentary, I sort of lose faith in the whole process, because I feel like you don't really know what you want to make. And the work that goes into making a 6-part series is very different than the work and the thinking that goes into making a feature. So, the more specific you can be, the better. And the more you sort of stand strong in your vision, the better. I think also research who you're pitching to. I think you should know, what is it that they can give you? What have they worked on before? The more you know who it is that you're talking to and what they might be able to offer you, the better. And I think tailoring how you're talking about your work to make it relevant to the people that you're pitching to, the better. So if I'm pitching to a distributor like Netflix, I'm going to pitch my idea in a different way than if I'm pitching to somebody who might be an independent financer to finance it. Just because, Netflix can offer me distribution, whereas a financer can offer me money. And, it's just a slightly different conversation. Also, some financiers like us, we only work on feature-length documentaries. So if you have a project that's a series, don't pitch it to us. Go to our website, research what we do. If you see on our website that it says we just do feature documentaries and that's not what you're working on, don't wait until you have a feature and then bring it to us, and don't sort of, don't waste people's time, basically. And do your research first, or write a little note and say, I saw on your website that you only do features. Do you ever do series, or is that, still the rule? And sort of just show that you've done that research and that you're not going to, that you don't want to waste someone's time. I think you always want to leave people wanting more. You always want people to be intrigued and excited. You don't necessarily want to say everything that you've thought about, but you want to sort of, just sort of like excite them and make them want to have a follow-up conversation with you to talk more about what you want to do. And in that same vein, sort of lead with your best stuff. If you have 200 hours of footage that you've shot with a scientist that you have exclusive access with, and it's amazing, lead with that. Don't put that late into the pitch. If you have, the rights to a really popular science book that you've bought, lead with that. We're the only ones that have the rights to make the movie version of this book, and we're really excited about it. Lead with the thing that's most unique, that's most sort of exciting, and that's your best stuff. And along those lines too, what is it that make you unique as filmmakers? I mean, this is part of like the team, but also like really thinking that through. Like, what do you bring to the table that somebody else might not? Why is this story something that you should tell? And just keeping in mind that, you're also selling yourself as well as your project to partners. People aren't just saying, yes, I want to work on that film. They're saying, yes, I want to work with you. I want to work with you on that film because you inspire me. And maybe I don't even really love your idea, but I just think you're so interesting and animated and great that like, I think we could workshop the idea together, or, that you're so, you've presented it in such a way that I'm so intrigued that I want to learn more about you. And maybe I'd want to work on your next film, even if I don't love your current one. So, just sort of keeping in mind that like, people are looking to partner with people. And so it's not just about partnering on ideas. It's also about sort of like, how do you connect with the people that you're pitching to, and how do they connect with you? And that's just such an important thing to keep in mind in general when you're pitching. So with that, I will just end and say, I'm so excited to hopefully hear some of your ideas in the future. And really just excited about the future of where science film is going, and all of the really interesting stories that have yet to be told in this arena. So thank you.